My hands, usually so steady, trembled just a fraction as I traced the phantom line. It was an imperceptible tremor, a ghost of an action, yet it was enough to make me pause. For years, the precise arc of a compass, the feather-light drag of a lead pencil across vellum, had been the very rhythm of my existence. I mapped the echoes of vanished cities, the forgotten contours of ancient trade routes, charting history with an almost surgical patience. Every river bend, every mountain pass, every fated settlement was a testament to human endeavor, rendered with an unwavering commitment to accuracy. My world was one of meticulous detail, of verifiable facts, of lines that led somewhere logical. Then the letter came, bearing the scent of old paper and an unexpected weight. It spoke of an inheritance, of a distant, ancestral estate I barely knew existed, a place whispered about in hushed tones during my childhood, a place my parents had always avoided. The estate, the solicitor's missive explained, was mine now. A responsibility, he called it. I called it an interruption. The journey itself was a descent into a forgotten corner of the world. The paved roads gave way to gravel, then to rutted dirt tracks that wound through a skeletal forest, branches reaching like arthritic fingers against a perpetually bruised sky. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of damp earth and something else, something metallic and cold, like distant iron. When the house finally emerged from the shroud of trees, it was less a building and more a monument to decay. Every surface was coated in a fine, gritty film that seemed to absorb light. Faded wallpaper peeled in curling strips, revealing plaster the color of old bone. The floorboards groaned under my weight, a chorus of protest with every step I took. For days, I moved through the house like a trespasser, my cartographer's eye cataloging the dilapidation, the structural weaknesses, the sheer, overwhelming weight of neglect. I had come with a sense of duty, a professional curiosity, intending to document, categorize, and eventually, divest. The library was the worst, or perhaps the best, depending on one's tolerance for the past. Books lay scattered, their spines cracked, their pages brittle. Here, amidst forgotten ledgers and brittle manuscripts, I found it. It was tucked away in a locked, brass-bound chest, beneath a pile of yellowed land deeds and a tarnished silver locket. A rolled parchment, surprisingly well preserved, its edges only slightly frayed, tied with a thin, faded crimson ribbon. I unrolled it on a cleared, dusty table, brushing away decades of accumulated grime. My breath caught. This was no ordinary map. My cartographer's heart quickened, a strange blend of professional awe and a nascent, prickling unease. It was a map of the estate, rendered with an obsessive, almost fanatical precision. Every contour line, every ancient oak, every winding path was depicted with a master's hand, the ink a rich, deep sepia that spoke of age and permanence. The scale was impeccable, the topography flawless. It was, in many ways, a masterpiece of its kind, far superior to anything I had expected to find in this forgotten place. But it was also horribly, unnervingly incomplete. More unsettling were the symbols etched into the margins, bordering the meticulously drawn features. They were not the familiar heraldry or survey marks I knew. These were glyphs, strange and angular, resembling nothing in any historical atlas I had ever consulted. They seemed to writhe, almost, on the page, hinting at an unholy geometry, a language of shapes that spoke of something alien and ancient. And then there were the unexplained features. A series of perfectly circular depressions marked deep within the woods, not natural formations, yet without any indication of purpose. My fingers, which had grown accustomed to the rough texture of the old parchment, traced these anomalies, a shiver running up my arm that had nothing to do with the cold air of the room. This map was a riddle, a challenge. It was a fragment of a forgotten truth, humming with an unspoken power. The precise, beautiful lines of the known parts of the estate only made the blank spaces, the strange symbols, and the inexplicable underground features all the more prominent, all the more menacing. It felt less like a document of geography and more like an unfinished prophecy. As twilight bled into a moonless night, I walked out onto the overgrown terrace, the map still burning in my mind. The air was frigid, carrying the sharp tang of salt and decay. In the distance, beyond the skeletal trees and the crumbling cliffs, lay the ocean shore at night with stationary waves. The dark water stretched out. It was a sight of desolate grandeur, yet it offered no comfort. Now, with the map in my possession, it had begun to speak. And I, Reed, the cartographer of the known world, found myself standing on the precipice of a geography I could not yet chart, feeling an irresistible, terrifying pull into the depths of its unwritten history. Now, that rhythm was fractured. The inherited map, with its unsettlingly intricate details and vast, terrifying voids, demanded my attention, a silent challenge to my cartographic soul. I rose with the sun, the early morning light painting the dust motes in the manor's grand, neglected hall. Determination, a sturdy anchor in my turbulent thoughts, pulled me forward. My tools lay ready, compass, measuring tapes, a modern GPS unit, and the ancient vellum scroll, now carefully unrolled on a clean, makeshift drafting table. The discrepancies between this ancestral artifact and the contemporary surveys were stark, almost defiant. Today, I would begin to reconcile them, to impose order on this inherited chaos. The estate sprawled, a wild, untamed canvas. Ancient oaks, their branches thick with generations of moss, clotted a sky that seemed perpetually overcast above the property. I began my meticulous grid walk, the crisp rustle of dry leaves underfoot a steady counterpoint to the low hum of my GPS. My eyes, trained to discern the subtle shifts in topography, scanned for the landmarks depicted on the old map. It didn't take long for the first anomaly to surface. Beyond a thicket of thorns, where modern deeds showed only an unbroken stretch of woodland, I found them, the crumbling remnants of a wall, its stones dark with lichen, its purpose lost to time. It was too substantial for a mere garden boundary, too deliberately placed. The map, with its faint, hand-drawn outline, showed a structure here, a forgotten edifice that no official record acknowledged. This was no simple error of omission, this was a deliberate erasure, or a profound forgetting. The sunlight, though bright above the canopy, struggled to penetrate here. They were not merely absences of light, they felt like presences. Then I found the markers. Rough-hewn monoliths, scarred with an age that defied my historical texts, stood sentinel. They were not evenly spaced, nor did they form any recognizable pattern of property demarcation. One leaned precariously, its apex fractured, pointing toward a stretch of boggy ground. Another, almost completely swallowed by a mound of earth, bore faint, indecipherable carvings, smoothed by centuries of weather into a suggestion of forgotten script. As I approached the third, a sudden, localized drop in temperature enveloped me. The air, warm with the late morning sun, thinned to an icy sheath around my wrists, though no breeze stirred. A low, resonant hum began then, a sound too deep for any insect, too steady for the earth's own tremor. It seemed to emanate from beneath my feet, vibrating through the soles of my boots, a subtle thrum that set my teeth on edge. It was not a mechanical sound, nor a natural one I could identify. It felt Ancient. Primitive. I knelt, pressing my ear to the damp soil, but the hum seemed to recede, only to return when I straightened, a mocking, elusive presence. My cartographer's logic, usually so robust, began to fray at the edges. The map, initially a guide, now felt like a curse, revealing a hidden layer of reality that defied rational explanation. The familiar comfort of lines and coordinates dissolved into a growing unease. What had my ancestors known? What had they buried here, so deeply that even the land tried to forget? As evening approached, painting the sky in bruised purples and oranges, I sought the solace of the boundary, the wild edge where the land surrendered to the sea. The vast expanse of water, usually a source of calming rhythm, felt strangely alien. The waves, instead of crashing and receding with their usual roar, seemed to hold their breath, suspended just before their break, a line of white foam frozen in time against the black mirror of the sea. The air was still, unnaturally so, devoid of the usual salty tang and the cry of gulls. A profound quiet settled over the landscape, heavy and watchful. Even here, at the very edge of the world, the estate's peculiar influence seemed to stretch, twisting the natural order into something unsettlingly inert. My mind, usually so keen to dissect and categorize, found itself grappling with phenomena that simply were, without explanation. The hum from the woods seemed to echo in the stillness, a phantom vibration in the very air. I was no longer merely exploring, I was being drawn into something I did not understand, a terrifying cartography of the soul. The phantom line, a whisper on the vellum, had stolen the steadiness from my hand, a tremor so slight it shamed the cartographer in me. I blamed the chill that seeped from the ancient stones, the late hour blurring the edges of my focus. My meticulous mind, a fortress built of facts and verifiable data, immediately sought to rationalize the anomaly, to file it away as an optical illusion, a trick of the straining lamplight. Yet, the memory of that almost line, a suggestion of a path where none should exist, lingered like a subtle ache beneath my skin. Later that evening, as I moved through the sprawling chambers, a flicker caught the corner of my eye, a ripple in the static air, just beyond the direct sweep of my gaze. Then came the sounds. Not the familiar creaks and groans of an old house settling into its sleep, but something more insidious. A breath, perhaps, exhaled from the very plaster. A murmur, so faint it was less sound and more a vibration against the inner ear, as if the walls themselves were gossiping secrets just beyond my comprehension. The subtle shifts began to accumulate. A specific volume, left spine out on the library shelf, would be found turned inward, its pages slightly askew. My compass, placed with meticulous precision beside the rolled parchment, would sometimes appear an inch or two to the left, as if nudged by an unseen, restless hand. Each instance was minor, easily dismissed as my own forgetfulness or an accidental bump. The air felt thick, charged with an invisible presence that seemed to press in from all sides. The air was frigid, sharp with salt and the iodine tang of the deep. They advanced and receded with a languid, unhurried grace, holding their form even as they broke, as if time itself had paused its relentless flow. Sleep offered no true respite. My nights became a succession of vivid, unsettling dreams. Sometimes, the map itself would unfurl in my mind's eye, its lines shifting, writhing, revealing new, grotesque features, arteries pulsing beneath the earth, a gaping maw where a spring should be, the skeletal outline of something vast and buried beneath the very foundations of my ancestral home. The lantern cast a soft, unwavering glow across the parchment. And there it was. Not a dramatic alteration, nothing that would scream impossible. But a faint, almost translucent line, a new contour I knew had not been there before, tracing the path from the ancient well to the dilapidated stable, then veering off into a dense thicket of neglected woods, where the original survey had simply denoted unmapped. It was impossibly thin, like a spider's silk. Undeniably present. It pulsed with a subtle, almost imperceptible luminescence when I stared at it too long. My breath hitched, a ragged sound in the quiet room. My meticulous memory, honed over decades, rebelled against the absurdity. I had studied every inch of this document, every ink blot and crease. This was new. This was wrong. The estate wasn't just old, it was aware. And the map, my precise, ordered map, was no longer a tool of discovery. It was becoming a living, malevolent guide, drawing me deeper into the secrets it had guarded, or perhaps, revealed. The tremor in my hand, a traitorous shiver that had mocked my cartographer's precision, had not vanished with the morning light. It lingered, a phantom echo of the previous night's disquiet, a testament to the unnerving line I'd found etched on the vellum. I could not simply dismiss it as the chill of ancient stone or the fatigue of late hours. There was something else, a subtle shift in the estate's silent pulse. Driven by a hunger for answers that gnawed at my composure, I turned my attention from the map to the estate itself. If the land held secrets, then surely its history, meticulously documented by generations of my lineage, would hold clues. The dusty study, a room I had previously deemed merely decorative, became my hunting ground. Shelves groaned under the weight of forgotten tomes, their leather spines cracked and faded, their pages brittle with age. I began with the oldest, a leather-bound ledger from the late 1700s, its script a spidery scrawl that took patience to decipher. It was not a grand chronicle, but a mundane account of harvests and repairs, until, buried deep within, a sudden, jarring entry. A brief, almost breathless note from a distant ancestor, a woman named Ilara, the quarry yields stone, but the earth yields sorrow. He wanders, unmoored from reason. As I delved deeper, the pattern emerged, insidious and undeniable. Journal entries, not always sequential, often fragmented, began to paint a mosaic of unease. I traced a finger across my own cartographic rendering, identifying a depression in the land near the old, collapsed well. Then came the letters. A sheaf of correspondence from the early 1900s, tied with a faded ribbon, exchanged between a concerned relative and the then owner of the estate, my great-grandfather. The relative's letters expressed growing alarm his mind seems to unravel. The final letter from the relative was a plea for him to leave the estate, for the madness of the land will claim you too, as it claimed the others. The others. A plural, echoing Ilaris he wanders and the steward's descent. I spread my map across the wide, polished surface of the study desk, scattering the brittle pages of the journals and letters around it. The folklore wasn't in any grand, published volume, but in the marginalia of a local history pamphlet, tucked into a journal from the 1930s. The phrasing was vague, superstitious, but the recurring motif of the land's malevolent influence, and the idea of a guardian or sleeping entity, resonated with a terrifying clarity. The air in the study grew thick, heavy with the dust of centuries and the accumulated weight of despair. My heart, usually a steady metronome, began to beat a frantic rhythm against my ribs. The map, once a tool of precision and order, now seemed to pulse with a hidden life, each crimson X a beacon of forgotten horror. It wasn't merely a guide to the estate's physical layout, it was a diagram of its illness, a blueprint of its malevolence. It connected two of the marked locations, forming a new, unholy axis across the property. The sheer volume of converging accounts, the escalating madness, the disappearances, all tied to the very features I had so diligently charted, coalesced into a single, horrifying certainty. The horizon, a barely discernible line where sea met sky, offered no comfort, no sense of boundary. The ancient journals, the cryptic letters, the hushed folklore, they were not just stories of my ancestors' undoing. They were a warning. And the map, my meticulous, precise map, was not just a guide to the land, it was a key. A key to something that had been buried for generations, something malevolent and demanding, now stirring beneath my feet. And I, Reed, the cartographer, had, with my own hands, begun to unlock it. I tried to work. The familiar scent of old paper and ink, usually a comfort, now felt cloying, heavy with unspoken histories. My compass wavered, its needle spinning with an unnatural lethargy before settling, not north, but somewhere indeterminate, pointing perhaps to an unseen locus of disturbance. Then, it happened. A whisper, not the sibilant hiss of air through an ill-fitting window, but a sound that seemed to originate from within my skull, a dry rasp that articulated a single, chilling word claim. I froze, pen poised above a half-drawn contour. My gaze darted around the study, a room suddenly too vast, too filled with shadows even in the midday sun. Nothing. Only the dust motes dancing in the shafts of light, indifferent. I dismissed it, a trick of a tired mind, a byproduct of stress. But the blood that had run cool through my veins refused to warm. Later, as I descended the grand staircase, a heavy, leather-bound book, an ancient almanac from the lower shelf, slid off its perch. It didn't fall straight down, but seemed to describe a slow, deliberate arc before thudding onto the polished floorboards. A plume of dust erupted, catching the light like a miniature, malevolent cloud. I stared at it, my breath catching in my throat. There was no breeze, no vibration from a passing vehicle. The house was utterly still, save for the frantic beat of my own heart. The incidents escalated with an insidious rhythm. Below. Hours. They were no longer confined to my mind, but seemed to ripple from the very air, vibrating against my eardrums, a chorus of unseen, ancient voices. I needed to talk to someone. My phone, a flimsy barrier against the encroaching chaos, felt suddenly useless. I fumbled with it, my fingers clumsy. No signal. I tried the landline, a relic I rarely used. Dead. Utterly, unnervingly dead. I walked to the edge of the property, straining to pick up a single bar, any connection to the sane world beyond this suffocating estate. I was truly, terrifyingly alone. I found myself walking, almost instinctively, towards the familiar, yet now alien, expanse of the coast. The waves, instead of crashing and receding, seemed to halt their approach just before the sand, their foamy crests frozen in an impossible, silent tableau. They pulsed with an eerie, internal light, a phosphorescent glow that seemed to emanate from beneath the surface, painting the dark water with shifting, spectral greens and blues. And then, from the heart of the motionless waves, a form began to coalesce. Not solid, not ethereal, but something in between, a shimmering distortion of the moonlight on water, a tall, gaunt figure that seemed to drink the light from around it. Its silhouette was vaguely humanoid, elongated, with limbs that seemed to stretch and writhe like kelp in an unseen current. The land demands. You are the key. Return what is ours. A wave, the largest of the stationary ones, finally broke, not with a roar, but with a sigh that seemed to echo the entity's words. It dissolved into 1,000 glittering droplets, each one reflecting a fractured image of the looming figure. I stumbled back, my feet sinking into the wet sand, my mind reeling. This was no trick of the light, no figment of exhaustion. This was real. This was a presence, ancient and malevolent, and it knew me. It knew my lineage, and it was demanding something terrifying. My mind reeling from the echoes that clung to the air like sea brine. Its words, however, were an insidious poison, seeping into the marrow of my bones, twisting the very fabric of my understanding. I turned from the endless, murmuring expanse, the wind a frigid whisper against my face, and began the slow, arduous trek back to the estate. Each step was a leaden weight, the sand clinging to my boots as if reluctant to release me from its strange embrace. The salt-laced air, once invigorating, now felt heavy, charged with an unseen presence that pressed in from all sides. My breath hitched in my throat, a shallow, desperate gasp for air that offered no true relief. The house loomed against the bruised sky, a skeletal silhouette against the pale, indifferent moon. The air within was stagnant, thick with the scent of aged wood, dust, and something else, a faint, metallic tang that prickled the back of my throat. My gaze fell upon the map, spread out on the heavy oak table in the study, illuminated by the single, sputtering oil lamp I'd left burning. It was a beacon in the encroaching gloom, drawing me in with an irresistible pull. The encounter on the shore had not broken me, it had sharpened my focus, honed my desperation. I saw the map now not as a puzzle to be solved, but as a prophecy to be deciphered, a warning etched in faded ink. I leaned over the parchment, my fingers tracing the familiar, intricate lines. The estate's boundaries, the winding paths, the forgotten groves, all were meticulously rendered. They were scattered across the map, tiny, almost imperceptible, yet now they pulsed with a malevolent significance. My gaze flickered to the old family journal, a leather-bound tome I'd found tucked away in a hidden compartment of the desk. Its brittle pages were filled with the looping script of my ancestors, dense with cryptic entries. I had dismissed most of it as poetic ramblings, the superstitious fears of a bygone era. Now, with a tremor running through my hand, I opened it to a page I'd marked weeks ago, one filled with sketches of the very symbols I saw on the map. My ancestors, these meticulous cartographers, were not merely documenting the land, they were charting a prison. The symbols on the map, when viewed through the lens of the journal's text, no longer appeared as random adornments. They formed a geometric pattern, a complex array that converged on a specific point deep within the estate's hidden acreage, a place marked only by a faint, almost erased X. This was not a treasure location. This was the seal. This was the prison. My breath hitched. The map, my heritage, was a blueprint for containment. And the entity that had spoken to me, the one hinted at in the journal's terrifying verses, was not merely a local legend. The journal spoke of thinning walls and the slow, inevitable seep. The seal was weakening. They were the entity's stirrings, its desperate attempts to break free. I was not merely an inheritor. I was a pawn, drawn by a lineage I never understood, specifically chosen. The map wasn't just a record, it was a test, a terrible inheritance. I was either meant to complete the work of my ancestors, to reinforce the weakening seal, or, through my unwitting actions, to shatter it entirely and unleash something truly unspeakable upon the world. The journal, a brittle skin of forgotten truths, slipped from my nerveless fingers, scattering across the study floor like autumn leaves. The words, thinning walls, inevitable seep, echoed in the hollow chamber of my skull, no longer mere ink on aged paper, but a prophecy unfolding in real time. The cold, which had been a creeping tendril, now became a suffocating shroud, pressing against my lungs, stealing the warmth from my very bones. They were the entity, stirring, stretching, reaching. It was awake. A low thrum began, not just in the house, but within me. Then, a voice. Not through my ears, but directly into the core of my being, a voice like the grinding of tectonic plates, ancient and vast, yet intimately insidious. Free. Me. Read. The sound was not words, not truly. It was a concept, an imperative, pressed into my consciousness with a force that threatened to splinter it. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to fight the intrusion, but it was useless. The voice was inside me, carving pathways through my thoughts. Come. To the edge. Where the veil thins. The command was undeniable, a magnetic pull that tugged at my deepest instincts. It wanted me. It needed me. Not just my presence, but something more profound, something tied to my blood, my lineage. I felt my legs move, compelled, not by my will, but by the insistent, horrifying presence that had taken root within me. I stumbled out of the study, through the echoing halls, the antique portraits seeming to watch my forced exodus with knowing, mournful eyes. The journey felt both instantaneous and eternal. The house itself seemed to groan, its very structure protesting the passage of its unwilling captive. The moon, a sliver of bone in the black sky, cast an eerie luminescence over the path leading down towards the coast. The water, black as obsidian, stretched out before me, reflecting the scattered starlight like countless shattered diamonds. The waves, usually a restless symphony, were hushed, barely stirring, as if holding their breath in deference to the entity's presence. A profound stillness hung over the vast expanse, a quiet that screamed of unnatural power. Here, at the precipice of land and sea, the entity's influence became absolute. I felt a pressure building behind my eyes, a surge of alien thoughts attempting to flood my own. It was an attempt at possession, a complete usurpation of my being. Yield. Your vessel. Yield. Your line. The voice pulsed, now accompanied by a searing pain in my chest, as if tendrils of ice were wrapping around my heart. It showed me a vision, the entire estate, not just consumed, but transformed into a living, pulsating monument to its malevolence, its influence spreading like a plague across the land, twisting life into grotesque new forms. In that moment of exquisite torment, as my own will began to fray, a desperate, almost forgotten memory surfaced. It spoke of a countermeasure, not a sealing, but a resealing. The journal had spoken of the anchor of lineage, a specific, personal offering, not of blood, but of will, a severing of the inherent connection that allowed the entity to seek out and prey upon the direct descendants of its original captors. To reseal it, I had to willingly, consciously, break my own ancestral link to the land, to this very bloodline that had inadvertently sustained its dormancy. It required a profound act of self-erasure, a spiritual amputation of my own roots, to deny it the very essence it sought to consume in me. The sacrifice was clear. I had to forsake my inheritance, not just of the estate, but of my very identity as a reed, severing the ancestral tether that made me its target. It was an act of immense will, a rejection so absolute it would leave me adrift, untethered from the past, from the very land I had sought to understand. The alternative, however, was annihilation, not just of myself, but of everything I knew. The fate of the land, and perhaps far beyond, now rested on my fractured will. The insidious command, a cold current in my veins, had become the only true north. My legs moved, not of their own accord, but as extensions of a will far older, far vaster than my own. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the marrow, that the time for mere investigation was past. The map, the estate, the lineage, they had all conspired to bring me to this precipice, demanding a desperate ritual, a commitment of soul and sinew. The path I now trod was not one I had ever charted. Beyond it lay a descending passage, rough-hewn and choked with the dust of centuries. Each breath felt like drawing in liquid ice. My lamp cast a struggling circle of light, battling the encroaching gloom. The stones here were slick with a persistent dampness, and the floor, uneven and treacherous, sloped ever downwards, pulling me into the earth's maw. Turn back, read, a voiceless thought slithered into my mind, soft as silk, yet sharp as glass. There is peace above ground. A life. A future unburdened. It was a temptation, insidious and sweet, painting visions of sunlit rooms and maps spread wide, of a quiet existence untouched by this festering horror. The passage narrowed, twisting like a tortured root. The stench intensified, a cloying sweetness now mixed with the metallic tang, like overripe fruit left to rot in a tomb. I felt the ground tremble beneath my boots, a loathrum that vibrated through the soles of my feet, up my spine, into my skull. It wasn't an earthquake, it was the land itself, alive and agitated, responding to my intrusion, or perhaps, to the entity's growing impatience. Then the illusions became more aggressive. The air shimmered, and for a terrifying moment, the passage seemed to collapse ahead, a cascade of stone and dirt rushing towards me. I instinctively threw an arm up, bracing for impact, but the vision dissolved, leaving only the solid, glistening rock. My heart hammered, a frantic drum against my ribs. The entity was playing with me, testing my resolve, trying to break my spirit before I reached my destination. It wanted me to succumb to fear, to turn back, to choose the illusion of safety over the terrifying reality of my lineage's burden. I pushed deeper, my lamp beam now struggling to penetrate a palpable haze that had begun to fill the passage. They clawed at the edges of my sanity, promising madness, promising oblivion, promising relief from the weight of this cursed inheritance. My breath plumed in the frigid air. The passageway opened abruptly into a vast, echoing cavern, its ceiling lost in the inky blackness above. My lamp, now a feeble spark in this immensity, revealed ancient, massive pillars of rock, carved by millennia of water, stretching into the gloom. But it was not the cavern's scale that stole my breath. I stumbled forward, drawn by its unnatural glow, and emerged onto a narrow, rocky ledge. It was an impossible sight. The waves, which should have been crashing against the jagged rocks of the shore, were utterly, unnaturally still. They hung, suspended, mid-curl, frozen in a silent, monstrous tableau of impending motion. The water, black as obsidian, mirrored the moon without a ripple, reflecting the skeletal light with an almost liquid stillness that was far more terrifying than any storm. The sound of the ocean, the familiar roar and hiss, was utterly absent. This was the revelation. This profound, unnatural stasis was the entity's doing, its influence so absolute it could halt the very breath of the sea. The shore was not merely a boundary, it was a threshold, a stage for the ritual, its waters held captive, waiting. And then, I saw it, directly ahead, on a low, flat shelf of rock just above the unnaturally still waterline, was an arrangement of stones. Not natural formations, but clearly placed, ancient and weathered, forming a rough, jagged circle. A basin. Waiting. The entity's presence here was overwhelming, a crushing weight that threatened to buckle my knees. It pulsed from the stationary waves, from the silent shore, from the very air I struggled to breathe. I was not performing a ritual to appease it, but to feed it. The cold current in my veins, that insidious command, had become the only true north. I walked, a puppet on invisible strings, through the gnarled woods, past the skeletal remains of forgotten outbuildings, the ground beneath my boots a squelch of mud and decaying leaves. The path, barely discernible, led me down a steep, treacherous incline, the sounds of the night, the rustle of unseen creatures, the distant hoot of an owl, seeming to recede as I descended. A different sound began to assert itself, a low, guttural sigh that was not the wind, but the very breath of the land. Then, a new scent, sharp and briny, cut through the damp earthiness, signaling my destination. It was a sight that defied natural law, a canvas of impossible stillness. Each curve, each ripple, each delicate lace of foam was held captive, suspended in an eternal, silent roar. The air, despite the proximity to the vast expanse of water, was utterly still, devoid of the usual salty breeze. The only movement was the slow, deliberate crawl of shadow as the moon traversed its arc. This was not merely calm, it was a cessation of motion, a grand, terrifying pause. I looked down at my hands, clutching the rolled parchment, the completed map. The map was no longer just a diagram of topography, it was a glyph, a key, a binding spell. A presence swelled around me, not from any single point, but from the very air, the sand, the impossible waves. It spoke, not with words, but with a torrent of images, of forgotten cruelties, of ancient blood spilled on this very shore, of the slow, creeping despair that had consumed my ancestors. This was the entity. It had no form, yet it was everywhere, an omnipresent hunger. It sought to break me, to consume the last vestiges of my will, to make me a permanent vessel for its malevolent influence. But I had come prepared. My cartographic obsession, my meticulous devotion to lines and symbols, had inadvertently armed me. The map, in its final, terrible iteration, showed not only the entity's prison but also the mechanism of its containment. The moon, now directly overhead, seemed to intensify its spectral light. I unrolled the map, flattening it with stones I found embedded in the sand. The lines I had added pulsed faintly in my peripheral vision, a faint luminescence only I could perceive. My head throbbed, a drum beaten by invisible hammers. The event, with trembling but resolute hands, I began to trace the final, crucial sigil onto the damp sand, mirroring the complex pattern at the heart of my map. As my fingers scraped the wet grains, a low hum vibrated through the ground, a sound felt more than heard, resonating deep in my bones. The stationary waves began to shimmer, the illusion of their stillness momentarily flickering, as if the very fabric of reality was being stretched taut. The entity recoiled, its silent scream a rending of the mental landscape. It flooded my mind with promises of power, of forbidden knowledge, of an end to all suffering if I would only cease. It showed me visions of a life unburdened, a serene existence, a false peace. But I pressed on, my focus absolute, my will a fragile, burning ember against its gale. The reveal/discovery, the map had shown me that the entity was not truly a creature of this world, but an ancient resonance, a malevolent echo of profound human suffering and avarice, amplified by specific geomantic ley lines that converged beneath the estate. It fed on the despair and the life force of those who dwelled upon its land, and the only way to contain it was not to banish it entirely, but to redirect its hunger, to give it a focus, a single point of endless, self-consuming sustenance. The final sigil, the one I was drawing, was a trap, a feedback loop. My finger completed the last arc of the sigil. The hum intensified, becoming a low, sustained thrum that vibrated up my arms, through my chest, into my very core. The stationary waves, with a soundless groan, began to ripple, not in the gentle rhythm of the sea, but in violent, unnatural tremors that shook the entire shore. The air grew frigid, biting at my exposed skin, and the metallic scent returned, stronger now, almost tasting of blood and ozone. It fought with the desperation of something being starved, something being severed from its lifeblood. It threw every fear, every doubt, every past failure at me, trying to shatter my concentration. I saw myself as a child, lost and alone in the vast, echoing halls of the estate. I saw the faces of those I had failed, their eyes accusing. But I held fast. I understood the lines, the flows, the boundaries. This was a battle of will, yes, but also a battle of understanding, of knowledge against raw, ancient power. As the final energy of the sigil coalesced, a profound change began within me. The entity's presence, which had been a vast, external pressure, started to contract, to pull inward, drawing itself into the trap I had laid. It was not banished, it was contained. The hum ceased. The tremors subsided. The stationary waves, though still unnaturally frozen, no longer shimmered with unnatural energy. The moon remained, a silent observer. I lay gasping on the sand, utterly spent, my body trembling uncontrollably. I had saved the land, perhaps, from its ancient curse, but I had not escaped untouched. I was no longer merely Reed, the cartographer. They would simply change their origin, now coming from within. I had won the battle, but lost a part of myself, a piece of my soul given over to the silent, waiting horror that now resided in my own heart. The cold, wet sand was my first sensation, a coarse awakening against my cheek. I lay sprawled, half submerged in the frigid grasp of the tide, the rhythmic sigh of water pulling and receding around me. Above, a sky like bruised velvet stretched, pierced by distant, indifferent stars. My body was a landscape of protest. Every muscle screamed, every joint ached with a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. A phantom weight pressed down on my chest, not physical, but an impression of immense pressure, as if I had been crushed and then carelessly discarded. I tried to move, to lift my head, and a jolt of pain, sharp and immediate, flared across my ribs, a dull throb in my skull. The metallic tang that had filled the estate, that had clung to the air and my very breath, seemed to have leached into my skin, a coppery aftertaste in my mouth. Slowly, painfully, I pushed myself up, my limbs heavy and unresponsive. Grit embedded itself into the raw skin of my palms. My clothes, what remained of them, were tattered, soaked through, and stiff with dried salt and something else. A glance down revealed the damage. Long, angry gashes marred my forearms, not deep enough to be fatal, but ragged and inflamed. My left shoulder felt dislocated, hanging heavy and useless. The skin on my face was tight, drawn, and when I ran a trembling hand across my brow, I felt the raised welts, the crust of dried blood, the faint, persistent tremor that ran through me. The silence was the most profound horror. The entity was gone. It was like waking from a dream, only to find the nightmare had imprinted itself upon reality, leaving behind tangible scars and an unfillable emptiness. There was no one. No rescue. No witness to the terrible, silent struggle that had unfolded. The world slept, oblivious, while I lay broken on the edge of its awareness. Then, a flicker. Not a sound, not a sight, but a sudden, jarring understanding. It wasn't a memory, not exactly. A comprehension of the lines, the invisible currents that flowed beneath the earth, the way the ancient bloodlines intertwined with the land itself. Something else. Something vast and terrible, now quiet, but not entirely erased. It felt like a foreign organ, pulsing faintly, showing me patterns in the sand, in the distant flicker of lights from the unseen town, in the very stars above, that I had never perceived before. The world was suddenly more porous, more interconnected, and infinitely more fragile. It was like a new language I had unwillingly learned, and now, even in my exhaustion, my mind kept trying to translate the world through its terrifying grammar. My eyes, heavy with exhaustion, scoured the distant horizon. Far, far off, a faint, smoldering glow painted the sky. The estate. My ancestral home. It was a ruin now. I knew it with a certainty that settled deep in my bones. The event that had transpired there, the terrible confrontation, had left its indelible mark, not just on me, but on the very land itself. I could feel it, a raw wound in the earth, a scar on the spiritual landscape. The entity might be gone, its immediate hunger sated or its essence dispersed, but it had not left me untouched. I was a vessel now, cracked and leaking, but still carrying a drop of its terrible wisdom. The silence was not empty, it was pregnant with possibility, with the potential for its return, or for my transformation into something new, something that understood the map not as a cartographer, but as a conspirator. I was Reed, the cartographer, but also something more, something less. The meticulous lines of my former life had been erased, replaced by the jagged, chaotic scrawl of survival. The cost was immense, my sanity frayed, my body broken, and my soul irrevocably stained. For I knew things now, things that could unravel the fabric of their blissful ignorance, and the knowledge was a poison, slowly, inexorably, working its way through my veins. The stationary waves continued their endless cycle, a mute testament to the secrets the sea kept, and the horrors I now bore. My breath hitched, a dry, rasping sound in my throat. My lungs burned with a memory of salt water, a taste that still clung to my tongue, metallic and bitter. How long had I been here? How had I arrived? Only fragments remained, the tremor of earth, the cavern's breath, the sudden, overwhelming presence that had demanded something. I pushed myself up, each muscle protesting with a dull ache. My clothes, heavy with brine, clung to me like a shroud. I had survived. The long walk back was a blur of numb determination. Inside, the air was still, heavy with dust and the lingering scent of something ancient and disturbed. The map, the obsession that had driven me to this precipice, lay where I had left it, unfurled on the drawing table in my study. Its lines, once so clear and purposeful, now seemed to writhe, alive with a terrible, hidden energy. I did not complete it. I could not. Its final lines had been etched not with ink on parchment, but with a deeper, more terrible understanding in the very marrow of my being. The entity was not vanquished. It was merely dormant. A sleeping leviathan, tethered by threads of ancient design, by the very land itself, and by something else now, something irrevocably linked to me. Days bled into weeks, weeks into months. I abandoned my cartography commissions, the meticulous work of charting known lands now seeming trivial, almost absurd. The world outside the estate felt distant, irrelevant. I found myself drawn to the property's boundaries, walking the perimeter with a restless, compulsive energy. The air here was different, thinner, humming with an unheard frequency. The earth under my boots felt alive, a vast, breathing skin over something unspeakable. He spoke of missing persons, of strange tremors reported by the scattered villagers. I offered bland platitudes, my voice flat, devoid of its former academic precision. He left, his eyes lingering on the closed-off wings of the house, on the overgrown paths that led to the cliffs. He saw nothing, knew nothing, and for that, I was grateful. It wasn't madness, not in the way the world understood it. It was a profound, terrible clarity. I knew the truth of the world now, the fragile skin of reality stretched thin over unimaginable depths. The price I had paid was not visible in scars on my skin, but in the alteration of my very essence. I was a sentinel now, bound to the land, to the thing that slumbered beneath. The map, still on my table, was no longer a project but a sacred, terrifying relic. I spent hours staring at it, tracing its lines, not to complete it, but to understand its existing symmetries, its intricate web of containment. I began to see new patterns, subtle shifts in the land's contours that spoke of ancient rituals, of deliberate placements meant to hold something vast and hungry in check. A new purpose took root within me, a grim, unyielding determination. I would dedicate my life to guarding this secret, to ensuring the entity's continued dormancy. I would study the land, not to chart new territories, but to monitor the old, to detect the slightest tremor, the faintest shift in the earth's silent song. It wasn't a threat, not exactly. More like a presence, a watchful, patient awareness. Was I truly guarding it? Or had I become merely another extension of its ancient, terrible will? The horror was contained, yes, but it was never truly over. It had simply found a new vessel, a new custodian. And that custodian was me.